No, we just need to know if our speaker's ready.
I think it might. My cell phone. These wires are in the way.
All right. Well, welcome. Welcome to the University of Waterloo. This is the Waterloo Institute for Health Informatics Research Seminar. We welcome you back after the summer term. So this is our first seminar for the fall series, and it is my pleasure that the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Health Informatics Research will be our speaker. Dominic Covvey has been with us for almost 5 years now, and one of his major areas of research is workflow. So I won't say anything more about our speaker because he will be more formally introduced by Maher. Before we start, I'd like to just have a couple of minutes to announce one thing for sure, and that is on September 26th, we are having a very special seminar which is open to the public. And this seminar is entitled, Why Not eHealthcare Now? The Resistance to Change in Our Healthcare System. The Honorable Michael J.L. Kirby will be our speaker. He is a former senator and the chair of the Mental Health Commission of Canada. He comes to us with a long list of credentials, but foremost, you should know that he wrote, it was underneath his guidance, that he wrote the recommendations for reform in healthcare. So we are so pleased that he will be our speaker. He will kick off our Smarter Health Seminar, and again, that is on Wednesday, September 26th. It'll be right next door in Davis Center 1302. We will be webcasting that as well, and we will be, for those sites that are on the Ontario Telehealth Medicine Network, we will be video conferencing that seminar too. So please come and join us that day. One other announcement is that we have just finalized the details for our next boot camp, Health Informatics Boot Camp. It will be held in York University in November 14th in the evening to Friday, all day Friday. So registration is open now. The early bird deadline ends on Saturday. So if you're interested in going to the boot camp, there are special rates for students, special rates for WER members, group membership rates, so, group rates. So please join us if you can for that boot camp. With that, I'll turn it over to Maher.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dominic Covvey is a professor and the founding director of the Waterloo Institute for Health Informatics Research. Dominic is a well-known expert in the field of health informatics for so many years. His research is in the representation and analysis of healthcare workflow, the definition of competencies and curricula in health informatics, and the design of the electronic health record. Dominic is a fellow of the American College of Medical Informatics and FHIMSS, the Healthcare Information and Management Systems Society, and a senior member of IEEE. Today, Dominic will talk about the latest research in workflow and will present a comprehensive framework for the representation and processing of dynamic healthcare workflow. Welcome, Dominic.
I don't have to do anything now. I just got the applause, so I just sit down. I sort of, when Shirley was doing that, I thought it was sort of like a word from our sponsor or something like that. I think we should do that. And we do, you know, maybe periodically you can interrupt with a little ad or something like that. First of all, I'd welcome questions at any time during this talk. This is a talk I gave at the eHealth meeting in Quebec City this year, and tries to summarize the work that the entire group has done. So I've listed all of us here: Don Cowan, Bill Malik. Bill's doing his PhD in Majed, who was in engineering at the time, working with us. David Henriquez, Joel So, and Shirley Fenton. So it gives a pretty good idea that this is not a single person's work, and I hope you'll take that into account. Yes?
If there are questions, we need to get the mic to them.
Sure. That's the only thing I'll ask you. If you do ask questions, we'll get a mic to you. So I just don't want to confuse anyone, but if you can keep the questions till the end, that would be great. For the people who are webcasting in, you can chat questions in too, so that you can ask a question and the person here will give the question to me at some point. So we'll talk about the problem of workflow, some of the current situation with regard to workflow and how it's dealt with in institutions, the purpose of the work we're doing and the methodologies we're using, the concept of contextual dimensions, which is the trying to associate workflow with its environment instead of just describing the workflow itself. Executing workflows, how that is being done, and the methodologies for doing that, and a little bit of detail for technical people who might be interested in that. But I'll leave that mostly to questions from other people.
Your mic is pointing away from you.
Okay. Not sure what to do about my mic since I don't have a central location. Excuse me 1 second. Yeah. Yeah, I'll try just pinning it on the center here. That should help. That should right in the center.
You've got your other thing on here, which makes it a bit difficult. Okay, try that.
Okay, so hopefully that was all reasonably well heard. I'd like to talk about the problem of workflow, and in looking at workflow, I see an awful lot of work in workflow, but I don't see that people have truly characterized what the issues are. So the main contribution that we've made so far is understanding the nature of workflow, trying to come up with a way of conceptualizing it, and then talking about solving it. So we're trying to look at workflow as a workflow problem primarily, rather than solutions. Just to give you a measure of solutions, 4 or 5 years ago we reviewed the workflow products in the industry. There were over 100 workflow products by as many companies on the market. And I'm sure the number now is even greater. Everybody has created means of automating, to some degree, flowcharts, either in the form of diagrammatic approaches or graphs or many other approaches to the problem. But there's very little about the nature of workflow, what the problem is in workflow, and particularly about where within the healthcare area, the workflow challenge cannot be resolved by simple approaches. And so we've tried to look at that. First of all, workflow is highly variable in healthcare, and there's a lot of intuitive execution, I call it. The taking of a person entering a process the way we enter processes. We don't come in and the door and then go to step 1 and step 2 and step 3. We tend to take a break and go down to the lobby or go upstairs or go in and do something and then come back and do something else. We don't use these formal, rigid processes in our work. We also, we've learned from research, don't use them in our thinking. Just give you one example. There was work done at least 10 or 15 years ago by people in health informatics that looked at how physicians made decisions. And physicians were asked, after they had made a diagnosis, how did they arrive at the diagnosis? And what they described was a very characteristic classic process, canonical process, that looked at this and formed a list and did this to test it and so on. Whatever the series of things was. Very, very, very nice explanation of how they came to the diagnosis. So someone had the brilliant idea of testing, rather than asking the people, of recording during the period of diagnosis by verbalizing what in fact they had decided and how they had decided it. It was entirely different. It was no relationship to this classic canonical process. If the patient walks into the room, you have a couple of characteristic things you'd instantly recognize. A, they're alive, they're well enough to walk in, and B, they're probably sick because, so already you get these challenges to you or knowledge to you that says where you're going in your diagnosis by what happens at the very beginning. So everything that happens in healthcare is based on conditions, like patient conditions. I'll talk about other ones, facility conditions and so on. Decisions made by the doctor, the family, the nurse, the patient. Situations that are different every day, all kinds of environmental changes. And I've gone through and listed them because we want to describe some of this in a fairly formal way. And preferences, which can vary, but you're probably aware, you've seen it in movies and things, that now and then in the old times, surgeons would throw things across the operating theater because they'd gotten something on the plate that was given to them for instruments that just didn't fit in. Well, every single procedure in a diagnostic imaging department, for example, has for each person, each radiologist, a preference sheet. And it's done that way. And different people do it different ways. And there may be 50, 80 people with their own preferences for each kind of procedure, which can run into the hundreds. So it's an incredibly complex preference environment. Cookbook medicine, which attempts to take diagnostic processes or therapeutic management processes and formalize them, really was looked upon as being one of the great solutions. Protocols. I wrote early papers on that in the 1980s. They've been implemented at many places. What's happening is that they're not being followed. So protocols are created. It says do A, do B, do C, but they're not followed. And part of the reason, we believe, is because of their rigidity, particularly their temporal rigidity in their execution. Doctors accuse that of being a kind of black box medicine, or cookbook is another word that's used. Many systems try to deal with one size fits all. You have a process and that's it. It doesn't recognize that that process is enormously variable. So it's a human environment, a cognitive environment. It's not a machine environment, and we need to somehow take that into account with workflow. Here's a workflow, and put anything in the boxes that you want. It could be a program. It could be a way in which a patient is seen by a series of people. It could be a clinical protocol to do A, then do B, then do C to the patient. It could be any kind of process is a workflow. So it doesn't matter what it is, any kind of process is a workflow. It also could be the way an instrument is set up, either in a kind of programming environment or in a similar context with its hardware. You can have many very complicated workflows, and I could have made this very, very complicated. I did a lot of work in laboratories, clinical laboratories, and whenever we did work in clinical laboratories and we created the workflow, we did it on paper at the time, we used to paper a wall at least the size of this room, that's in this room, with flow charts to the height a person could reach and right to the floor with pieces of workflow. A single clinical laboratory will have thousands of steps, many, many variations, and just documenting it is extremely challenging. So when we put those workflows up on the wall, it was very difficult for anyone even to understand them, to look at them, let alone for them to be used to guide processes within the department in real time. So a workflow can be very, very complicated, but no matter how complicated, if we've set it up in this way, in a rigid way, there can't be variations. You can have options 1, 2, and 3 there, but you can't have other options. And of course, in every environment, exceptions will occur, and that set of exceptions is enormous. The processes we have in healthcare depend on many, many variables. And this is where I said I'd begin to show you the nature of the process change aspects, the variables that we deal with. Some examples at a high level are preconditions of the patient. In other words, a patient with diabetes versus one without. The presumptive diagnosis. You may think the patient has tuberculosis, and you will behave in a way, for example, with isolation techniques, that depends on that. Or there could be many, many medical situations for the patient's sake. Patient's clinical state, well, sick, close to heart failure, whatever it might be, very important. The potential for beneficial intervention means that you look at, gee, I've got this patient, is this going to do any good? I mean, the patient's arrived, it's in the process, but will this make any difference for the patient? We're going to subject the patient to perhaps introduction of tubes into their body. We're going to give them chemicals that might, in fact, cause allergic reactions. What is the benefit? Is it worth the risk that's being taken and the pain that's being undertaken by the patient? Previous history, allergies is an example. If you give them certain kinds of, for example, in diagnostic imaging, you inject something called contrast that makes them, their organs or vessels more visible when they're looked at by x-rays or computed tomograms, tomographs. The real-time choices, the patient says, I want to stop. I've had enough. You have to stop. Family decides that in the case of someone that isn't compos mentis. Current medications will make a difference. A person on aspirin, if you're going to cut their groin to introduce a catheter, they're going to bleed a lot more, and maybe seriously. So you have to deal with that. And it may, in fact, have to put off the procedure or deal with it with special follow-up or surveillance afterwards. Facility availability. Does the equipment work? In every diagnostic imaging department, every day, there's dead equipment that cannot be used. It may even change the kinds of equipment that's used, because if this, as they're called, modality is down, it's like an X-ray or a computed tomograph or MRI, if it's down, you may use another technique, but you choose that based on the problem you're facing, the particular exam, and the patient, and a few other things, including availability. There are clinical guidelines if you're involved in, particularly in cancer. In Ontario, CCO, Cancer Care Ontario, has created very specialized protocols for every type of cancer treatment, which are so complex. There's actually work at the University of Manitoba when I was there on artificial intelligence techniques being used to guide family physicians in how to give chemotherapy to patients, because the process for that is so complex with so many possible problems and types of medications and so on. Diagnostician, I mentioned preferences already. Staff availability. Certain procedures require, for example, a thing called an ERCP, where you actually do it, I won't explain that, but it requires a radiologist and a GI specialist, and usually a special technologist that's been trained in this procedural work, which involves introducing tubes into the body, in that particular case into the nose. That type of availability of staff is crucial, and they have to have certain training. They have to be certified in certain ways or be knowledgeable in that area. And finally, the economic, quality, and regulatory constraints. Many, many constraints are put on healthcare. You've seen it in the newspapers about medications that, if you're over 80 years old, you're not going to get a $30,000 a year drug in this province, at least unless you pay for it. It could also be which contrast agent you use in radiology ends up being appropriate for price. Some of these are very largely more expensive than others. Now, just to give you an example of a situation, I focused on diagnostic imaging. Some people call it X-ray, but it's more than that. Radiology is another term that's used. And I've looked at the problems, and my wife's a radiologist, so I credit her on walking me through all the things. I did part of it, and she filled in many, many gaps. And it's interesting. It'll take a little time, but it will give you an idea of the problem that we have. When a patient comes in, has the exam been ordered? Patients show up and the exam isn't ordered in this busy department. You can't deal with them. Is it in the schedule? They come down without their charts. Is it available? That may require getting the chart. Is this the patient? Patients come down, they scan your armband, you're not the patient. There was a case in a hospital I used to work in where the CEO of the hospital was sent down to radiology because he had a transient ischemic attack, a sort of a temporary stroke, you can think of it as. And he was sent down to diagnostic imaging, and he was asked, "Are you Mr. So-and-so?" And he said yes, and he wasn't, and he was given contrast media that could have killed him. I mean, this is a person who works in a hospital. So many times this happens with drugs and so on. Has the patient been prepped? Have you been properly shaved, or have you not had a meal since midnight, or whatever the preparation needs to be? Are the current meds you're on appropriate given the exam? If you're on certain medications, you can actually trip the person into an arrhythmia or cause a problem. I mentioned the bleeding example. Do you have any allergies? You may show up for the first time. You ask the patient, they have not been asked before, do you have any allergies that here, or a reason you shouldn't have this exam? For example, that you've been exposed to some agent that could affect people and you should be kept in, let's say, isolated conditions. Is the exam ordered appropriate to the clinical situation? You wouldn't believe how many exams are ordered that are totally inappropriate. My wife got a request for an exam for a nasopharynx study. And they had actually done a lower GI on the thing. And in other words, they were going to introduce tubes into the guy's back end. So we had a joke about that. Are they trying to sneak up on the diagnosis? But that's the kind of thing that shows up. The wrong leg is examined. In surgery, the wrong leg has been removed, so this happens. Does the patient consent it? They agree to it, or their family. Is the technologist, nurse available, diagnostician? Is the room available? Is the needed equipment available and ready? And if not, what alternatives do we have? So I haven't even gone to the second layer of this. The diagnostician want to continue. You can decide that too much risk for the patient, this doesn't make sense, should be put off for some reason or other. Which modality? It may have been an X-ray that's ordered when, in fact, more appropriately, a computed tomographic study would be done, or an ultrasound. So you have to go and make sure it's appropriate. And it may switch. It may already have a result from somewhere else, and it wouldn't be appropriate to repeat it. Now, I want to point out, too, that this type of decision-making is characteristic of academic departments. In many, many community institutions, it may be that a lot of things are just done as requested. That can be a problem in itself. The procedures, I mentioned the diagnostic imaging professional plus the gastrointestinal professional for these ERCPs. Which contrast? There are new contrasts with things like computed tomographs or MRI. Gadolinium is used as a contrast agent. Which one should you use? And if you give that, may you induce renal failure in the patient, failure of their kidneys. Which modalities set up? In other words, you set the instruments up based on how thick the person is and how heavy they are. It could be for the breast, that's very important in setting the image characteristics, but every part of the body, you need to look at that. You may want soft tissue information. That won't show up if you use high voltage radiation on them. It'll just go right through the tissue, be barely visible. Need for isolation. One example today is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus or tuberculosis. That idea of isolating patients is crucial today with some of the bugs we have around. You've probably also heard of C. difficile. The order for exams, if you give a person, for example, for an upper GI gastrointestinal study, you give them barium. It's very, very contrasting. It blocks everything out. You cannot, within 2 weeks, I think it is, do, for example, a lymphogram where you introduce contrast into the lymphatic system. You wouldn't see it. You'd miss major parts because of all the barium in the body that would block it. Are there any crises that occur during the exam at any level? Another room or this patient? Is the diagnostician, shall I continue the exam during the exam? What's the patient's condition after the exam? Because the workflow doesn't end until the person is at least ejected from the department. Do we miss something? We have to do extra views on the patient. That happens very, very often because a key part of the examination just happens to be off the picture that was taken. And finally, is the patient able to be discharged? It might give you a sense in one department of hundreds of areas in a hospital, certainly of 20 or 30 major departments in a hospital, you have an incredibly complex problem. And I haven't dealt with the second layer beyond this, which is, I'll be doing that for another purpose. The current situation, we've got a growing awareness that workflow is a key frontier in health informatics. Nobody had heard of this 5 years ago. We need to understand and particularly re-engineer and even evaluate workflow in healthcare settings. We need technologies available. Today's technologies allow us to build applications, but there's a huge problem in this busy, very complex healthcare environment. They're inadequate to deal with that, particularly in the rapid changeability of the environment and the number of options. Systems can be used to execute clinical protocols. There's much literature on this. And I've pointed out to you that there's interesting work out of Regenstrief in Indianapolis that this is not working at the center that actually did the first work and has promoted it for decades, at least 2 decades. There's a huge problem in any kind of human system workflow coupling. The problem is that humans and systems don't necessarily work well together when other humans are involved, and the human-system interaction blocks the human-human interaction, or the human, in this case, doctor-patient or doctor-other-doctor interaction. Some challenges in workflow is limited by today's representational techniques. Classic techniques are really good about flowcharts, essentially, but there's no context in a flowchart. And very little work has been done except for the very minor aspects of context. Some people have introduced techniques, for example, for representing the types of human resources that are needed. Competencies of actors, in other words, is the person qualified, affects things. Regulations affect processes. Why you're doing the process affects a process. And many other aspects we'll talk about. Classic workflow descriptions are lacking in their expression of the role they play in the business. In other words, if you look at a workflow, you can't tell why it's there. The classic example I use of that is that when I was doing a lot of laboratory re-engineering, I found that I would look at a process and find this stupid bunch of steps, and I'd say, well, let's get rid of them. And they'd say, well, we can't because it's required by regulation that we do that recording of that separately. That's not clear in looking at the flow chart. It should be. Classic workflow methods are okay for prescribed workflows. In other words, if you have a reasonably uncomplex workflow, you don't really need context, but they don't have the robustness to deal with the dynamic workflows of the healthcare environment. Now, dynamic, just to give a temporary definition, means highly changeable workflows with many options. And those options may only be discoverable as you mine past workflows. They may not all be known at the time. And you may have exceptions that no one's thought of at any given time. I've already mentioned that many decisions drive the workflow. And if you represent them classically, your workflow charts become ridiculously complex. And the representation becomes complex. And what's worse is it doesn't even include the contextual elements. The problem with, too, a lot of classic representations, they can't be evaluated. So we can execute a workflow, like we can guide someone, or we can make machines do certain things, but we don't have technologies or techniques or methods for taking a workflow and comparing it to another workflow and saying, is one more efficient than the other? Is one more effective than the other? Why? Because the definitions of efficiency and effectiveness are outside the workflow itself and absolutely depend on contextual knowledge. So the purpose of the work, basically we're trying to get away from the bonds of classic workflow. We looked at extending existing methods, found that you can't do it, and then focused on more deeply understanding workflow. So our purpose is to define a framework or frameworks for representing, processing, and evaluating dynamic healthcare workflow. This allows us to address the true nature of workflow in real situations. Methodology we've used, and a bunch of things here, mainly software engineering and database concepts, and Bill Malik, I believe, is here somewhere and can answer, even he's in the back there, answer questions about that. Areas of work analysis that are my background, workflow engineering to some extent. And interestingly enough, we found some ideas from physics that were useful in terms of the interaction among different contexts and workflows. So that had an impact on what we've done. So we looked at a radically new way of representing complex, dynamic, human, machine interactive healthcare processes. And we're able to now represent processes without the limitations of classic processes. So some of the definitions and thought processes behind this, so some of the results we've achieved. First of all, we recognized that workflow always occurs in a business context. There isn't a workflow in vacuo. It's not that way. It's always in a context. And the context can exist at many levels. And at the ultimate level, it's at on a world level, global level, national, provincial, whatever. And even within an organization, there's an organization. Every level of the world determines context. For example, ministry budgets at this level could impact departmental activities at that level. So context is within context. And what we're trying to do is really totally model that context, I guess, in the ultimate sense. Some examples of context are federal law and standards at a national or provincial or even regional level, regulations, which tend to be at that same level, inter-organizational agreements that can exist about who will do what, how, and what will be done and what your purpose of your organization is. That now is occurring regionally in this province through the local health integration networks. Organizational budgets determined at an institutional level and will soon be determined at a regional level what the institution is supposed to be doing and what it does and what funds it has to do it. And process guidelines work at a departmental level. This is how we're going to deal with patients who come in with certain problems. Or at an individual level, this is how the doctor is going to deal with the patient in a clinical protocol. So there are these outside aspects, if you want, we call context. We looked at context, we call them dimensions, because they relate, if this is a step in a process, and there are many steps, let's say, going this way, these are some of the kinds of dimensions, probably fiscal, maybe requirements, maybe objectives, maybe value, whatever. These are contextual elements that determine and influence the action that's being taken and or the person or document that is acting or being produced. So some examples are there. The subcontext inherit all the dimensions of larger context. So we may start from the ground up, but what we really need to do is start at least at an institutional level to understand context. And maybe in the future be able to look at beyond that. So we need to look at the context on an institutional level. So a diagnostic imaging department is part of an institution, and it inherits from that certain contextual limitations. One example, a simple one, is a budget. It gets a certain budget to do its work. If it blows that budget, the institution today is in trouble. There are now agreements with the ministry about budgets, and the hospitals no longer have the ability to run deficits without let's say, getting into a pretty deep doo-doo in what they do. Of course, if a budget at an institutional level is such and such, obviously the departmental level budget will only be a component of that. Workloads are defined within a context and inherit its dimensions. And contextual dimensions incorporate many components, are best thought of and has an abstract class of subdimensions. So basically, this is the idea of the contextual dimensions. The real workflow picture though, is that not only do we have workflow going on here, which are these little odd green colored things, but all of these dimensions have a flow as well. So in other words, if we have a purpose for doing something, parts of that purpose are fulfilled by each action. If we have a budget for doing something, parts of the budget are spent, where the heck is doing, budget is spent doing those actions. So there's a flow in each of the contextual dimensions as well. So they make up a picture that needs to be dealt with. And by the way, there may be several workflow processes, and there always are within a department, that compete and get their allocation to those various dimensions. So one or more workflow processes may coexist. They always do. You'll have patients going through one process in diagnostic imaging, for example, the computed tomographic unit, or the orthopedic studies. You'll have others going through the MRI and doing something else. They may have separate processes for inpatients who come in through one door, literally, in a local hospital, or outpatients come in through a different door. There can be workflow processes not only related, obviously, to patient care, but to equipment maintenance, quality assurance of the process, reporting, the financial aspects of the department, et cetera. So there are many workflow processes that occur within a given department. All of these are constrained by this contextual information, in fact, the same contextual information, inherited at a departmental level, and each workflow must operate within constraints at this level, and by their interaction, they constrain each other. So in a simple example, if I run pick out something, the MRI unit or whatever, if there were such a thing, and I have a zillion exams and they all cost a lot of money, the rest of the department is going to be in trouble when it comes to budget. It's not going to have the funds able to do this. Time is obviously a consumable resource. Staff is a consumable resource. All of those things, as you suck people into one thing, they get sucked out of something else. So it's overall a zero balance kind of problem to actually have these workflows interact with each other. Simple example of a contextual dimension. This is so much obvious that it's worth it, but if you haven't looked at it before, it might be of some value. If you have an enterprise operating budget, let's say a global budget of some amount, that's the fiscal dimension at the enterprise level. The department's fraction of this is some component, and this is what they get, where it's very much less than the entire organization. And then fractions of this will be available for each workflow in the department. Now, that isn't the way it's done daily, but that's the way it really happens. That's what goes on, if you want, in the interactions of the department. So research on the representation of processing contextual information has been being carried out by Majed Al-Shawa, just to give a person credit who's been working in that area. We've had another student as well. It's interesting as we thought this through to visualize a workflow and think about it as a line. Here's a line operating in a three-dimensional tube. The workflow proceeds through time. If you have any constraints or any of these contextual dimensions that have been set for this workflow, they are consumed. So if it's set here, they're consumed until at the end of the workflow. Hopefully you get to the end of the workflow before this goes to zero. So it's kind of interesting in that each workflow also constrains itself. You have a problem. And if you run off here, you're beginning to run a negative budget, for example, in the department, and that affects everything else. If here you have an increase in the activity that you need to do, that's going to take staff from somewhere else. So it just gives a picture, and that's just a magnified view of the same thing. In the execution of workflows, there's a concept called workflow engines, and I thought this was kind of cute. Bill will get maybe a kick out of that. One thing I've said, and this is really promotional or slogan, it's not absolutely true, but it's useful to think of it this way. Workflow is history and only history. Defining workflow before the fact is really, in this situation, not feasible. What you can do is define all the pieces of workflow and then allow them to be assembled. What's done afterwards, that record, is the workflow that's occurred in the department. And each time a different patient goes through, and each time the department, each day is different with different physicians and everything else, you're going to get a different workflow. And one of the areas that's very important is workflow mining, the ability to take from workflows data that's able to be brought in and then used to guide and say, well, yeah, you've got this massive set of possibilities, but in this situation, the most likely set is this. And then you can come close to the specialization or customization of workflows based on situation, patient, doctor, whatever. So the workflow engine, which takes descriptions of workflow and can then execute those workflows, guide workflow processes, or run a machine or whatever it might be, have two components: a decision component under our conceptualization, a decision component and a service selection component. Services are functions that occur within a department. So a service might be, at a macro level, the reception area. Another one might be the MRI exam room, MRI exam process. It should be process, not room. A micro part of that service could be within the reception area, the checking of a patient. So there can be processes within processes here. But there are only two components. A service selection component that says, I want to receive the patient now. I want to do an MRI now as the next thing. And a decision component that made that decision as to what needs to be done. And if you look at that in a little bit more detail, this is a concept of a services server that has, I think of it as a shelf of all kinds of services. And these services have associated with them, and this is a simple example, more than this, but preconditions that have to occur before that service can be executed in whatever circumstances. It might be able to be executed with no precondition in a super emergent situation. And postconditions, things that need to be done after it. So a simple condition is, in order to do an angiogram, you have to have had somebody do a certain piece of work beforehand, and then after it, you have to have somebody put pressure on the groin so that this bleeding stops. Angiogram is an X-ray study involving catheters introduced into the body or contrast introduced into the body. So these various services exist with conditions. The service selection engine, this is using either inferencing and or mining. Now, mining allows us to look at most common things, and inferencing is the decision process itself, will be used with interaction with the people around it to choose these services and compose the historic workflow. So let's say activity B was done first, activity A was done second, and activity C was done third. And that was the way it happened, and that was allowed by the pre and post conditions. This allows an intuitive entry into this process, only then governed by requirements within the processes themselves. So you can't, in a simple case, you can't remove the gallbladder unless you first somehow cross the skin. There's got to be a precondition there of entering the body in some way. Model allows the definition of work comprehensively and allows it to be executed dynamically. Allows entry into processes at any point, not just at prescribed processes. It moves away from the cookbook concept, in other words. Those are the technical persuasion. This is a little bit of stuff from Joel So, and I probably won't do as good a job as I need to on it. The concept of dynamic workflow, that real-world processes are intricate and highly changeable. So the focus on real-world has been what we've done. Classic charts allow reasonable representation of real-world process when we know what the workflow is and it's highly prescribed. So we're okay with the tools here. But even the most static workflows have dynamic components, and that makes any workflow, even in a static environment, challenging. We've designed an approach involving service selection and real-time composition. Consider workflows to be services, where you've got to receive patient service, register patient service, produce report service. Services are predefined and may be composed of more granular services. Services can be provided by a services server on request by the engine. Services have preconditions and postconditions, most like any kind of service-oriented architecture. They describe what they do, and there may be variants of services. To choreograph these loosely coupled services now to do this is, first of all, service selection units select services both statically and stochastically. So our data that we have on previous workflow instances is really crucial. The inference engine-based service selection mode selects services based on workflow participants' decisions and on historical data collected from past instances. This is the mining. And by the way, it's both Bill Malik and Joel So's contributed to this. If the selected service indicates it must be preceded or other things need to occur, then it needs to back off, and that could vary according to the seriousness of the circumstance, i.e. the patient is dying. You've got to do something different. You can't be constrained. In this probabilistic model, services are selected at runtime based on criteria, for example, available contextual knowledge of the current workflow instance, the one we're doing right now, statistical knowledge mined from previous workflow instances, and rules and constraints based on that we've already built around the contextual knowledge. Services can be sequentially invoked, thereby providing backwards compatibility with prescribed workflow models. In the workflow instance, continue selecting services until it address all the services to complete the process. And of course, the workflow with contextual knowledge now itself can know that. It knows that it's done if the contextual knowledge is there. And I'm not sure why I got back to that again. There's some other details here. I'm not sure if it's of very much interest to people, but a quick version of it is that the work that Bill has been doing, particularly with Don, has been adopted from Jackson and Twaddle. It uses entity relationship models as a representation technique. The models can be managed as a database. Entities are anything that's part of a data model. It could be agents, any part of a workflow. Tasks are the services applied to those entities. Relationships are sequential passing of control from one task to another in a workflow. So it can be in any order that's appropriate, allowed. Storage of workflow data allows dynamic modification. Entities are stored in the database as tables, and contextual dimensions can be incorporated as fields in a database, and their magnitudes as field values. So very much a database model is involved here, and really gives a good structure for doing it. Rule sets are stored in a database to drive system components for inferencing, mining, selection. A query now becomes the workflow engine. Queries embodying the inferencing capability. We've implemented declarative. By this mean they're just saying how to do it, not what to do. Declarative workflow representation technique. Research into the true meaning of dynamic workflow is being carried out by our two authors. I mentioned Joel So and Bill Malik. Bill's now started his PhD and did his master's on this, and Joel is just in the process of completing his master's degree. And Joel is interested in the potential of using existing workflow languages modified appropriately to go as far along this dynamic dimension as possible. He happens to work with Microsoft and very much believes in industry representations being the basis. So rather than creating something new, he's interested in seeing what can be done with what is there. And just to mention that all this has been built on the web-based informatics development environment developed by Don Cowan. So workflow visualization. I want to mention this is that this is a piece of work being done by David Henriquez, who's also completing his master's this or next month. We've recognized that workflow occurs in a spatial environment. It's one of its contexts. So workflow in this room would be different from workflow in an unpopulated room, an empty room. And various instruments add barriers and things that can be done and so on. So you're very much space dependent. Turns out that after a lot of work, David found out that IFC5 exists that allows you to, in detail, represent space. It's almost unknown. He looked for something like 6 months, almost went out of his mind, wondering if you ever get to the end of it. And then talked to somebody in downtown Waterloo in the engineering department who said, I've heard about something called IFC. Would you look it up? And bang, it was it. And there are now a few competing things as well, but IFC appears to be the most comprehensive. You can describe everything that happens in this room and probably even all the furniture with IFC. The wall, how thick it is, what's in it, what supports it, is it a supporting wall, its dimensions, obviously, the color of the paint, the type of paint, whatever. All of that is representable. It's been developed with a lot of military applications, and complete descriptions of military buildings, which may explain why they all look the same, have been developed using this technique. So you literally can set up something, and if you want to change something, you just go in and change the description. I mean, it's sort of like a data description language, the DDLs, the real-time DDLs that we've talked about in databases. So what he's doing is taking this work on IFC as a representation technique, then inheriting IFC definitions of space into ARENA. So we actually, ARENA, which is a simulation package, which allows us to look at, in a very obviously simple examples, of a workflow described in, doesn't matter what flow chart, of taking that and simulating that workflow in a spatial environment, but where the spatial environment is entirely described, associated with the workflow. So you now can say, I've got 4 different spatial environments. How will this workflow work, or look, in this case, look, in these different spatial environments? The down end of this is looking at efficiency and other aspects of optimization to really carry it much further. This is the work with Joel So, workflow extensions. I'm not sure I really need to go into this, but let's see if I can find something. His reason for doing this work, I've sort of described it as I've gone along, because it's been said that only when a standard workflow does not meet requirements of a workflow language, it should be, and cannot be executed to meet requirements or extensions are too complicated, should a new workflow language be created. I agree with that. We're creating so many of them, it's kind of crazy. So he's trying to develop a reusable framework for extending existing commercial workflow platforms to support dynamic workflow. Very, very interesting piece of work. My conclusions, to just kind of wrap this up, we have a growing awareness of the importance of workflow in healthcare. This year, they actually have quite a few papers in the American Medical Informatics Association on this topic. We gave the first tutorial on that 4 years ago. People had barely heard of it. Now this is kind of erupting out of the space. And one of the reasons is that the people who have been involved in health informatics aren't interested in buildings, aren't interested in budgets, aren't interested in any of this other stuff, and yet these are the contextual dimensions. And so they've been interested in diagnosis and patients. So there has been now a movement of people who come from the fiscal or administrative sector into the area, and I think finally we're beginning to understand the problem. A good example I give of this is back in the 60s, I think it was 64 or 65, I read a book on translation of languages. And that book said that we would be translating English to Russian and back again, because that Russian was important at the time, in 2 years. And we're now 2007, which is some 30 years later, 32 years later, and we still don't have decent translation packages. The failure there has been to understand the problem, and our focus on the problem, I think, is crucially important if we're going to really make progress in this area. Classic workflows are too constraining to deal with the variability. We need a representation that allows the dynamism to be expressed and flexibility, have to allow the incorporation and processing of contextual knowledge, and we need to enable end-user customization without a lot of trouble, and this includes in systems, of having a version per site. So if everybody takes a very complex workflow and changes it in minor ways, you get a zillion of them. You don't even know which one you're using. We've talked about companies, for example, having workflows on the shelf. The Mayo Clinic reception process, the Stanford way of dealing with MRIs or something. And that's quite possible as long as it's done in a dynamic environment. Otherwise, there's so much variation that for the local environment that it wouldn't be able to be maintained. We need the ability to visualize workflows in space. This provides a framework for realizing these kinds of systems. I believe it will help us toward being able to semi-automatically evaluate and optimize workflows within their many constraints. We're not there yet on that one. And it provides a new systems architecture that Don can talk to enable the reduction of barriers to end-user adaptation of systems to satisfy changing requirements. I want to thank the Natural Science, NSERC, and particularly CSG and others around here for their support of this despite many, many challenges. Thank you very much. So if you have questions or comments, and I really ask Bill and let's see who else is here, Don, to make comments and fill in the gaps.
Well, I'm not sure I'm filling in any gaps, but a few comments. Unfortunately, workflow in some sense has a bad name, and it's too bad we can't change the name, because workflow, we tend to think of workflow as documenting what we might call an assembly line process, which is usually fairly straightforward, although getting more complicated by the day, or an set of office procedures which somehow fit together. And this is, I think, something we need to do better is come up with better definitions. Basically, dynamic workflow is combinatorially explosive. That's what the issue is. Right. And you had that chart on the wall. I bet you didn't capture all the decisions that were being made even there.
We didn't capture any of the decisions. We only captured what people felt were the common things that occurred or needed to be done.
The other thing is that workflow, there's a whole bunch of, I'll call them business process languages or workflow languages, whatever you call them, out there. They are programming languages which are used to represent the workflow. When things get combinatorially explosive, a programming language is not the way to go, because it just, you very quickly lose comprehension what's going on. You need to build some form of data structure that captures this, that allows you to annotate easily, which you then can generate the programs, if you want to use a programming representation, from that data structure. But you don't want to start with a program, because it just becomes totally uncontrollable very, very quickly. And I must say that the idea of the data structure originally came from Michael Jackson, who wrote a book and then didn't quite realize what he'd actually done in some sense.
Yeah, the focus on dynamic, by the way, came from Ken McKay. We were talking in a large meeting about workflow and began to realize that we were thinking of workflow like a manufacturing process. And he said, well, There's another kind of manufacturing process that's totally different, and it was called something shop, job shop. And yeah, you come in with an example, a helicopter blade, and you have to do something with it. Well, you essentially reprogram the way in which things are done based on the requirements, mil specs in this case, of what needs to be done with that particular thing and what it is and so on. So a job shop is really quite like, I wish I could stop these things from clapping. It's distracting me. It's really quite like a healthcare process, but still not anywhere near as complex. Okay.
When you go into a clinical setting, a hospital, excuse me, how do you apply the workflow research? Do you start the hospital as a whole? Do you start an individual department? How do you instill workflow into a real world setting?
Well, first of all, workflow occurs. It's already there. What's not true about work...
Or management of workflow.
Okay, management of workflow. There always, in any department, is a process for managing workflow. It's just very loose and not, it's tacit.
So how do you make it explicit?
The only way I know to make it explicit, we've also done some work with Ken McKay on documenting workflow using the ideas behind this. So capturing all this other information, which is a very, very difficult process, and would have to be able to be carried out continuously because it'll always change, either by direct talking to people or through the mining activity as you find things occur. If you carefully describe and fully describe all of the services and the general context, and you allow the addition of context and addition of services, then the workflow that occurs using those things, and you learn by looking at the mining of the workflows, you know, what the common things are for a given kind of patient, a given kind of situation. So you have a kind of a learning environment that would give you the data. But what you continuously do is you update the services, improving them, putting new pre and post conditions, for example. You update at least the data in the we call it the contextual dimensions. We have new contextual dimensions that come up too, and then you have all that you need to provide whatever guidance you want to that situation. So
Well, I would imagine this is a people problem as well, that people are may not be explicitly aware of the workflows they follow, and part of your job becomes making them aware so that you can improve upon what they're doing.
No, you're absolutely right. Most people who are involved in workflow don't know anything about the workflow they're doing. They don't know. They may even not even know why they're doing it. So it's somewhat rote. So what you probably have to end up doing is making people aware of what it is that they're doing and why it's important and all those kinds of things. But I've really not given any thought to that. How do you make workflow as a formal process a part of the nature of an organization, so that people are aware of it. That's happened to some degree through CQI, continuous quality improvement, and total quality management, and 5 Sigma or 7 Sigma, whatever it is. That type of process is introduced into healthcare, and awareness that there are processes that have dimensions and limitations, constraints, or whatever, and that need to be documented and re-engineered. So there has been, over the last about 15 years, a fair amount of experience in the health system. And we're not at the point where we can become ISO 5001 certified or something like that, but where everything is documented. But there is an awareness of the importance of processes and in following within at least an envelope of activity in processes. So I guess it would be enhancing that CQI, CTQM framework in the departments.
We have a question from the web.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Good question from the web. We'll come to you then. Go ahead.
Okay, the question from the web, Stefan has asked, let me see here. The question is, given the complexity of the healthcare contexts, is dynamic workflow management tractable with current systems?
No. Workflow is not tractable with current prescribed workflow systems. That's the problem we have. They don't deal with it. And Joel is asking the question is, how far can we carry current representation techniques and languages, with this knowledge to make them closer to that ability. But we don't believe that it is feasible. And we don't believe that prescribing workflow is an answer no matter how much you're helped to do it, because it will always change, it will always vary, and it really, workflow, like we've described here, with a dynamic selection of services, documented in a workflow database as a history of workflow and then mined, is, we believe, the way in which we need to have an organization. Because now we have an organization that truly learns its own behavior and thereby sets up how things will probably go, but takes into account, I remember Jan Steiner's quotation, when you've seen one, you've seen one. And that's got to be every patient, every day, in every diagnostic imaging department. When you've seen one, you've seen one. And tomorrow there will be a variant. It wouldn't be interesting unless that were true, I think, for most diagnosticians. It's so much changes by situation. The web and the information patients come in with has dramatically changed the nature of healthcare, because patients come in sometimes more informed than their physicians. So I hope I've answered Stefan. Stefan Potazzi, just for those of you who don't know, is a professor at Conestoga College. And Stefan is probably the best abstract thinker I've met in my life, particularly came out of the UVic program and has done some incredible work. So he's there with Yuri Kaigalovsky. I don't know what Conestoga College did, but they've got two of the best people in the country.
Just a couple of other comments to follow with what Chris Ann said. First of all, you can't prescribe it because there's just too much variability. Although I guess there's a possibility, but it's not, you would probably never get it all right. So the other way that Dominic says is we capture it. The trouble is capturing it on the fly is not trivial either, especially in certain situations. I mean, if you're in an operating theater, are you going to stop the operation or you record what you did? No way. So there's got to be methods in there. And even such simple things as doctors recording what they do when they're talking to a patient, other than using the old scribble technique, is still rather rare because they find it costs them time. 45 seconds a patient, I've heard, which means you can see 3 more patients at the end of the day, and you can either think of that as doing better work for your patients or of maximizing your income, and I don't care which it is. So there's real issues here, but I do think this is heading in the right direction. We just don't have all the pieces by a long shot.
Other questions or comments? Bill, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Great presentation.
You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to ask a question or make a comment.
Let me see a question. One question, and it comes a little bit from Stefan, but it's also one of my own. He asked something to the effect of, wouldn't it be better if you're talking about dynamic workflow, doesn't it really come down to trying to mimic human behaviors or human thought processes, since for the most part that's what determines what a dynamic process is? So he gets to the point of, doesn't that mean AI? And I'm curious, what do you think? Do you think there is any such thing as intelligence first? And is it possible to make an artificial one?
Well, we've kind of translated AI to machine learning now, which is probably a more appropriate description of what goes on. This is machine learning. I mean, inference engines and things like that. It's a machine learning system. So yeah, I believe that AI, machine learning, is relevant. That's what this is. But you're absolutely right that what we're doing here is attempting to represent human behaviors. And I would argue the same thing exists in our attempts to create systems that can work with physicians, where those systems are supposed to help physicians in cognitive behaviors. In other words, where it helps you make a diagnosis or final suggestion of therapy. The current systems don't work well with physicians. They don't align their way of going through a problem and dealing with the issues in the same way the physician does. So it tends to be difficult for the two things to synchronize. So absolutely, it's exactly the same problem. And this behavior set, luckily, has a lot of systems components in it. For example, as you do various processes in a diagnostic imaging department, today those are recorded either through RFID or through scanning barcode labels or some means, so that when a patient goes into a room, it's scanned. When the patient leaves the room, it's scanned. So we get a lot of process knowledge from what occurs and which room the person went into and so on. So it's to some degree self-documenting. What Don's pointing out is the individual behavior of physicians is not well documented. And often we don't document all the decisions that are made. And somehow we need a means of capturing those within our departments. And it's not just because we want to do workflow research. It's because those decisions are medical, legal, in fact, clinical issues. And they need to be documented. And they haven't been. So activity-based recording or activity recording using PDAs, as you move along things by the technologist or by the physician, him or herself, will probably be a part of any future we have anyway.
Thanks.
My question is, how, with looking at your context and the subcontexts, how can that deal with situations where one context is causing a perverse result in a procedure in a subcontext, such as the upper context requires that a certain procedure be performed, but it's simply a law that has no meaning or a regulation that's lost its meaning, and now it's just wasting people's time in the subcontext. How can we cull out those kinds of things and make processes as efficient as we can? Does your model address that?
In a simplistic case, it could. We haven't done the full contextual modeling, so I mean, this is a guessing game at this point. But think of the fiscal dimension. Let's say that the institution has a budget of $100 million and it allocates $5 million or $10 million to the radiology department. Let's say the radiology department, because of a whole series of events, airplane crashes, whatever it is, ends up with $15 million worth of business. I mean, it's violating then the context. What you do is you document that, and financially you run a deficit. There's got to be, though, some way of setting off the alarm bells so people at the top are aware that that occurs. So one of the things that can happen here is that feedback that these things are going outside the context that's been set, the constraints that have been set, can be fed back to people. And then either the budget can be increased or the expectation of a deficit can be recognized and dealt with the ministry or something like that. So we have the ability to feed back. But does the model itself deal with that? No, it just would record it, showing that you had 10 million, now it's costing you 15, you're 5 million over budget. But it would be doing that in real time.
You showed like kind of those lenses that are getting smaller, like the context gets smaller, and you mentioned, well, let's hope that we can finish the process before that the dimension, it collapses to zero. But it may be that the process can't end because, for example, we're dealing with an emergency case and we can't say to the patient, well, sorry, we just ran out of money a minute ago, so we won't be able to do this imaging.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the line goes past zero, and it goes into the negative part of the thing. But that means that other workflows either do not have the resources or you have a deficit budget. That's all it means. So it only becomes important in the interaction of multiple workflows. A single workflow going over $500 over budget is probably not a big impact. But yeah, they will go to negative. But this becomes then a model, if you really go into depth, of how the fiscal process of an organization works, and can provide, I mean, in the greatest dreams you might ever have, well after the time I'm dead, it might give you the ability to create a model of an organization that had the feedback in it to allow early decisions in those kinds of situations. But you're absolutely right. Not just a patient in difficulty. It turns out that the patient gets very excited on the table and needs to be held down because they're demented, let's say. You need other staff. You suck staff from somewhere else. What are they going to do? So there are many consumable resources. And I've done a lot of my thinking about consumable resources only, not purpose and other things like that. But the consumable resource dimensions are relatively straightforward to represent, at least the thinking-wise, are relatively straightforward to understand and I think represent.
Privacy and security legislation is another one. Do you care that somebody knows that you wear glasses, but you might care about whether they know you have a genetic disorder? So, in fact, we've got this blanket legislation which is ridiculous in many ways, and somehow should be modified. And how do you build in feedback loops, in effect, that make that happen?
I don't think the public has any idea how much innovation is being suppressed by the emphasis, very often by young cookbook, textbook people, on privacy in our organizations. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of money that's going into the maintenance of something that isn't on most people's radar screens. Thank you very much.